Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Kitty. Primetime at the Bethel Library is a collaboration of the Friends of the Bethel Library and many different offices on campus with the mission of encouraging lifelong learning beyond the classroom for the entire Bethel community. Faculty be on the lookout for research papers that your students can submit for the highly prized $250 library research grant. The deadline is February 15th. Join us on Thursday, November 3rd. Chad Hoyt from Phillips will present recent research using lasers and a magnetic field to cool and trap millions of lithium atoms at a temperature of a few hundred microkelvin, whatever that is, minus 459 degrees Fahrenheit. His presentation is entitled "The Coldest Place on Campus by a Factor of 100,000." My office. Today we welcome Faculty Excellence Award winner for service, Michael Dreher of Communication Studies, as he presents Learning While Serving, a different way to think of service learning. And if you don't know Michael, I have a short bio. Dr. Dreher is recognized for his consistent and extensive servant leadership and involvement both within and outside the Bethel community. He has offered his expertise as Associate Editor of the National Forensics Journal, Associate Editor of Parliamentary Debate, and is the longest-serving Associate Editor for the Communication and Theater Association of Minnesota Journal. From 1998, I wasn't even alive then. His service in the forensic community is far-reaching and includes service in numerous capacities at all levels. Michael has been recognized by his forensics and debate peers by being elected to leadership positions at the district level and by being appointed to the Executive Council at the national level. At Bethel, in addition to serving as the Communication Studies Department Chair, Michael has served on many different committees and has provided key leadership, particularly as a member of technology-related committees and task forces. So let's welcome Michael.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Haslund. I'd like to thank the Friends of the University Library, the Office of Academic Affairs, and Faculty Development for their sponsorship of today's presentation. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. In honor of my debaters, they would probably say that now that the thank you part of the speech is done, let's begin. When I look to see who has won this award before me, Dr. Robin Haslund, Dr. Karen Drake, Dr. Neil Dutton, Professor Karen McKinney, Dr. Naomi Ludeman-Smith, Dr. Eric Gossett, Dr. Barrett Fisher, and many others, I'm humbled. And then I think of the old Sesame Street song and feel like it's titled, "One of these things is not like the others. One of them just doesn't belong." For I look at my colleagues and I realize the many great things that they've done, not only for Bethel, but for the larger regional, local, and national community as well. And then I look at the actual requirements for this particular award. It says a service contribution. How are others benefiting from your service? The long-range potential of this service, and the ways in which this service connects with the Bethel community. And then I think, well, wow, did I really do any of this? And I haven't created missionary organizations like some of my colleagues have, although I did help a church with its website for a few years. I don't do things that affect thousands of students at Bethel, although arguably what I do is probably far from glamorous. But I think the lessons that I've learned, and perhaps the lessons that I can share today, are that it's the little things that contribute to a life of service. Perhaps some of what I've learned and some of what I've done can resonate with you, and perhaps helps us to think about the ways in which we can connect our passions of learning and service together in different ways. As Dr. Haslund mentioned, I am chair of the Communication Studies Department, and I direct our forensics team, which is intercollegiate speech and debate. And so the question is, well, why is it that we serve? What is it that we try to do? Well, many commentators have suggested that service is really a form of ministry. In fact, some have even gone so far to say that we define service as ministry, and vice versa. No matter what denominational background we come from, service is still an essential part of the Christian life. And as I was preparing for this, I found very interesting a quotation from Pope Benedict's personal pastor. who said the following. Father Cantalamessa. It's a good thing I'm not Italian because I can never pronounce all those names. He said, in fact, one of the principles by which the gospel has influenced the social sphere most decisively and beneficially is precisely that of service. Not for nothing does it occupy an important place in the church's social teaching. Jesus made service one of the pivotal points of his teaching. He himself had said, he came to serve, not to be served. And as Jennifer Fullwiler, a writer from Austin, Texas, observed service in this way. What is the meaning of life? To know, to love, and to serve God. And how do we do that? Well, the short answer is by loving and serving others. That's why we were created, and that's what we're supposed to do. So why did I entitle this talk anyway to be about service and learning? Because after all, one could argue that that sounds a little bit selfish. I mean, is it that we're in service just because we learn? I would contend not. And in fact, if anything, part of what Jesus has taught us is that we should be in this kind of state of lifelong learning. We're called, in a sense, to use the knowledge that he's given us in order to serve others. And in a way, I look at my career in terms of service, the kinds of things that I've done, as one manifestation of that. How is it then that I can take the knowledge, the things that I have learned, in order to serve others? And so part of what I wanted to do is to share a little bit of that story in the sense of what is it that I've learned and perhaps what is it that can help us as we not only look forward here at Bethel, but indeed on our own Christian walk. As Dr. Haslund has mentioned, I've done a variety of things in terms of technology. And ironically, here I am not actually giving you a PowerPoint or a cool video or anything like that. In fact, if one were to walk into my classroom, one would find that I'm almost kind of the anti-technology type of person. One of my colleagues, Dr. Lita Frazier, who's here, said that we tend not to use such things because discussion is really what's most important to me. It's what I learn from others as I listen to them, as I hear them. And I think that kind of typifies how we look at the realm of service. And that is when we work with others, we have the opportunity to learn from others. When we see the perspectives that we ourselves do not have, we can appreciate those perspectives and then use those to learn from other people. Many, many years ago, I was part of an organization while I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa called the Baptist Student Union. And some of you have heard of that. It's, although we say up north that it's a Southern Baptist type of organization, perhaps we don't often talk about that so much. But while I was a part of the Baptist Student Union, I really got to know a friend by the name of Sue quite well. And Sue had been blind for a long period of time. And one of the things that amazed me about her was the fact that she was able to carry on a very normal life, despite the fact that she wasn't gifted with the ability of sight. And to see her do the kinds of things that she did, one day I happened to go to her workplace, and I wondered, just as probably many of us do, well, how is it that she gets along with a computer? How is it that she's able to do the kind of things that she does? And to see her to be able to utilize the technology, despite some of the other kinds of complications she had in her life, was utterly amazing to me. And it also led me to wonder, well, how many other people need those same kinds of assistance that she has? How many other kinds of people could benefit? And the lessons that I learned from her stuck with me. But when I think about how some of what I've learned has translated into service and vice versa, I think about my work with the realm of web accessibility. Now, it's probably a good thing that my colleagues in ITS are not here this morning, because they would probably tell you that I can be a little bit of a pain in the butt when it comes to the role of accessibility, in particular with regard to things such as our website and Google Apps. It's one of those areas that I've long called for because really, in a sense, when we think about the new technologies that we have, we really shouldn't say that those technologies are only for 85% of people or for 90% of people. If God has given us those technologies, they really should be for everyone. And so then the question becomes, how do we best utilize those technologies for the benefit of other people? And so that led to my work in terms of the realm of web accessibility. And just through a kind of chance encounter Sue was not even a student in the BSU. She just kind of hung out with us. But the kinds of lessons that she taught me in terms of how people manage and live their daily lives are the kinds of lessons that still stick with me. And so those of us in the Bethel community remember a person who served us for many, many years in the realm of disability services, Kathy McGilvery. And so part of what I think about is, as I see people like Sue, and as I see people like Kathy, I ask the question, what is their perspective? How do they see things? And as I work on some of the things that I do, how can I utilize their perspectives to help me and to help others, to kind of do the work that we need to do? So part of that is to then say, okay, now what do I need to learn? Where do I need to grow in order to best help them in terms of my realm of service? But then we see some other things too, in terms of those skills that transfer to helping others. And I know that when it comes to college faculty, the A word can be a very dirty word sometimes, and that would be assessment. Because our colleagues in education have long told us how important it is. But sometimes on the rest of the faculty, like I said, we think of it as the A word that we would rather not deal with. But I found that on my sabbatical this year, I spent a lot of time thinking about assessment. And thinking about now, how does that knowledge help us? How do we use that to serve other people? And then I think about the students in my classes. And I think about the students in our major. And it really forces me to ask the question, now, how is it that I can take that knowledge and to better serve them? What is it that we're doing well that will help them in life after graduation? What is it we're not doing as well that we need to improve in order to help them with life after graduation? So again, just a simple little thing. But if we think about it in terms of service, we really start to ask the question, not just, is this something that we're forced to do, but rather, how is it that we utilize this knowledge, in a sense, to help other people? Now, some of you know I'm a little bit of a history buff. I did have a cognate in history while I was in graduate school. But as I find my service has kind of led me toward another area that seems relatively trivial at first, but then when you think about the life of any organization, how important it becomes. And that's the notion of institutional memory. That, for example, you think about the people, and I think about people like Dr. Gossett and Dr. Carlson, who have been part of this community for many years, and Dr. Fraser and many others. What will happen when they're gone? They leave us an important kind of institutional memory, sense of how things have been at Bethel, how things have been within an organization, and then how then do the lessons that they've learned help us in terms of the kinds of struggles and kinds of crises that we deal with today. For instance, that's how I look at some of my work on committees, and especially some of those committees that I've been on for a very long period of time. It's what can I do with that information? What can I do with that knowledge? What can I do with that institutional memory that will help other people? For it's not good to just kind of collect that memory without doing anything with it. That's the part of the so what. Okay, so we have this institutional memory. Why does it matter? And what do we learn from it? And in the realm of forensics, that's part of what I've been trying to do, is to try and bring more of a sense of institutional memory to the kind of activity that we do. For those of you who have been involved with forensics for any amount of time know it's a very kind of burnout-based activity. The average life of a director of forensics is about 5.5 years. So one could argue, why am I still doing what I'm doing? I mean, I'm more than almost triple past that point by now. But again, the answer comes back to institutional memory. For when you have lots of people going through the activity, there's no sense of kind of where we've been, or no sense of what we've learned as a result of that. When it comes to, for example, the National Parliamentary Debate Association business meetings, I find that people bring up these issues and then you realize, wait a minute, we've talked about this issue 3 years ago, and 5 years ago, and 7 years ago, and 12 years ago. But without that kind of institutional memory, the organization, in a sense, does not advance. In fact, one of the things that I realized, too, when it comes to an organization called the National Forensic Association, is that we're in great danger in terms of losing that institutional memory. Because what's happened is that for many years, people never recorded who actually made it to the final rounds of various national tournaments. And so part of what my goal has been is to try to recover that institutional memory for the organization, to find out who these people were, why they were so important, and in a sense, what can they help teach us as well. Because I think what happens oftentimes, especially in the realm of forensics, is that we tend to go toward the fads. We tend to go toward the things that have just happened. I mean, forbid you would actually use Shakespeare in an inter program these days. The immediate thing that would happen is the judge would say, this is too old literature. It didn't come from 2010 or 2011. You're going to take last place in the round. Yet on the other hand, what we find is that those people who have come before us, have tried some classic things and they've worked quite well. What can we learn from them? Well, my argument is we can't learn from them unless we know who those people really are. It's the development of that institutional memory that we need in order to understand what we've done and, in a sense, where we're going. And I think the same thing applies to the work that I've done in terms of the national forensics calendars. Because part of what happens is, again, we have tournaments. We don't often think about what kind of long-term trends that we have in terms of the activity. Now, Dr. Fraser could tell you all sorts of stories from when she was director of forensics here at Bethel University. And she probably won't want to at this point, but I remember at that time, we had all sorts of different kinds of debate that we don't do here anymore. Different styles of tournaments. Different schools that hosted tournaments that no longer do, schools that were not part of the activity at the time that are now. Without gaining that sense of institutional memory, without gaining that sense of what have we done, what's worked and what hasn't, we in a sense cannot progress as an activity unless we do that. And without someone to kind of, in a sense, bring up that issue of institutional memory, we as an activity lose a great deal. So in a sense, as I think about some of the lessons that I've learned when it comes to some of the things that I've done, a lot of it comes back to history. And I'm sure that my colleagues, Dr. Gertz and many others in that department would be very glad to hear me talk about how important history is. But again, it's a history that's derived from serving. And it's a history that's derived from learning as we serve, to find out again what that institutional memory is. So some of you are thinking, okay, that's fine. Well, how does it help us as students? Well, one of the things I've also learned in terms of forensics when it comes to serving is how important it is to kind of develop a team culture and a sense of team history. As we share stories of things that have happened, and any of you who have been part of organizations know that one of the important things that we do is we tell narratives about the organization. In fact, Walter Fisher once termed it as the narrative paradigm. Man is the storytelling creature. And when we think about those stories that we tell about the organization, or as Ernest Borman might suggest, the kind of fantasy themes that arise from the organization, part of what happens is we learn more about ourselves, and people who are part of the organization learn more about the history of the organization. So just as I think back to what happened when I first came here, kind of how I try to share those stories with our students, since that helps them to appreciate not only where we are now, but in a sense where we've been in the past. And I think a lot of times, especially in this day and age, when we think about technology, and we think about, in a sense, how it encourages us to think in the here and now, and in some sense, the immediate future, the piece that we're often missing is kind of what's happened to us in the past. And now Google and archive.org do a wonderful job in terms of helping us to find some of those web pages. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't help create the narratives for us. And that's where we come in. By helping us to make sense of what happens, whether it be at Bethel or whether it be part of a national organization. That seems to me an important part in terms of the notion of service. That as we think about how we serve other people, how we integrate other people into the organization, and in a sense make them feel valued, make them feel like they're relevant, that they're significant and important. And it's not always easy to do that. I think about the mission statement of our forensics team. that we say that our job is that each person has a role on the team. And our role as coaches is to help them define what that role is and to help them to find out how forensics can help them, not only in what they're doing now, but in life after Bethel. And that sounds pretty nice, pretty important. But the practical aspect of it is it's very hard to do without thinking about it from a service perspective. Because if we think again in terms of the here and now, the easy part is to think about, okay, what events don't we have covered and who do we need to kind of fill those events? And it's easy to kind of think along those lines. But the more important thing is, what will our students be doing after graduation? How do we best help to serve those students, not only now in terms of the competitions we go to, but in life after graduation, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Where do we make sense of all of that? And in a sense, if you think about the kinds of things that I've talked about here, yeah, some of those are Bethel related, some of those are not. In a sense, they all point toward the same thing, and that is, again, how do we help each other? And I think one of the things we often associate with the notion of service is, well, I can't do that. I'm not significant enough. In fact, I kind of alluded to that in our introduction today. But then when you look at the biblical example, you realize how very untrue that is. Sean Robinson wrote in his book, Practical Christianity, none of us is insignificant. We can all make an impact. We may not be a Billy Graham or a Robin Hassel. No, that wasn't in the book, but I just added that. But God will put us into positions where we can serve and glorify Him. All we have to do is ask. And the example that he provides in terms of talking about that is Stephen in the New Testament. And as you remember, what Stephen did was he ministered to people by basically waiting on tables. You recall at that time that the early church was growing tremendously. You know, we were talking about exponential growth in the church. And there was the dispute about how food was going to be distributed. Well, you recall at that time that the apostles knew that basically their job was to keep preaching and that they needed some other people to come alongside them and help them in terms of doing some of the very practical kinds of things, like feeding people. And so 7 men, including Stephen, were carefully chosen for that task. And the disciples knew that those men would make a great impact on those lives that were surrounding them. And we think, well, sometimes, okay, I'm on this particular Bethel community. It doesn't seem like a very important thing to do. Or I'm on this committee at church or in some other organization, and it doesn't seem very significant. But my contention here is that what God would do through that, He can find a way to make what seems to be insignificant to be very significant for His purposes. As we look at Stephen and what happened, you know, the word of God kept spreading. And as Acts noted in chapter 6, verse 8, it was because of people like Stephen who, full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. And he wasn't any less important than any others. I mean, he, again, served food. He merely allowed God to use him out of a life of obedience. And I think what oftentimes we see here is that, again, it's very easy to take an assignment, whether it be a committee assignment here on campus, whether it be some other kind of assignment, and to say, well, this doesn't seem very important. Why should I do this? Why does it make? Why does it matter in the great scheme of things? I think the important point here is that the tasks that seem insignificant or trivial to us really aren't when it comes to God. J.B. Phillips, the noted Christian author, wrote the following back in 1956 in his book, New Testament Christianity. Our gifts vary enormously. We all can't be evangelists, pastors, or teachers. We can't all be leaders or bear great responsibility. But there is certain to be something, some worthwhile piece of service, which only you, the reader, can do. It may be exciting, it may be humdrum, it may be participating in a new venture, or it may be merely routine. The apparent importance of it does not really matter. What is of real consequence both to your church and to your own soul is whether you're willing to give yourself sacrificially. And I think of many, many of my colleagues here who fulfill that description in terms of the kind of sacrificial work they do, not only in terms of students, in terms of some of the committees that people are part of, just the ways in which they act for causes well beyond just themselves. And I think that's really what the important thing is. Whether it be, sometimes the thankless task of going through all of the promotion and tenure documents that we have to go through, which I hear these days are kind of about like this, as I see a couple of my colleagues who have been on that committee kind of affirming that. Whether it be the looking through the applications of, students who are appealing the grade, or students who are trying to get into the honors program, or a variety of other kinds of things. There are many of these kinds of huge jobs that seem somewhat thankless. But then you realize through that service, and you realize through what God mentions, that it's not really trivial, it's not really insignificant. And as I see Dr. Gossett, I realize that, for many years he and I have worked on the honors committee, and we've gone through, I don't know how many honors applications. Several. He's gone through probably about 1,000, I would say. And I've gone through maybe a couple of hundred in comparison. But what I find is through that service, not only have I learned a great deal about the students who are coming here, but I've also learned a great deal about my colleagues as well. I've learned, in a sense, not only what they value, kind of by learning their perspectives, even if we don't necessarily agree on a particular application. Through the experience, though, what we learn is that all of this has the same thing in common, and that is it all seems to matter to the people involved. And ultimately, it all seems to matter to God. Sometimes when we get in those passionate discussions, we realize in part it's because we do care. And we recognize that God is working through those kinds of situations. Now, finally, what we think about when we think about service is, in a sense, service is all about a manifestation of faith. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 12 and 13, "This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of God's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, men will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ." And if we're doing what he asks us to do, and if we're serving him in the ways that he asks us to serve, in a sense, we will have that manifestation of Christ come through. Not only in terms of our fellow Christians, which sometimes is arguably more difficult, but also to those currently outside of the Christian community. For in a sense, all of us have the ability to serve, and all of us touch in our service lives, both within the Bethel community and outside of it. And it's how we do that service, and how, in a sense, we deal with that manifestation, and as Paul mentions, supplying not just the needs of God's people, but indeed the needs of all people, that we see really how service goes through. And with that, again, I'd like to thank the Faculty Development Committee, to thank the members of the library, Friends of the University Library, Academic Affairs, and all of those who have truly humbled me and blessed me with this particular honor. When I realize, in a sense, this honor is not just about the kinds of things that I've done, but ultimately, if there's anything that's important about it, it says that what we do as a community is important, and that as we recognize service, we're recognizing each other, and we're recognizing all of the things that go on here at Bethel University. So, thank you.
What if people want to ask you questions, Michael? We have a few minutes.
Okay, sure.
I was just wondering if when you talked about the institutional history of the forensics, if you have followed any of those people and found out what they're doing in their lives, and if their participation had an impact on what they chose to do or how they were looking.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it has. I mean, when we certainly look at even some of our own alumni, for example, not every alumnus who does forensics goes into law, although quite a few have. But I think of one of my former students who told me this story. He's worked as a youth pastor, and he was one of our first parliamentary debaters when I came here at Bethel back in the late 90s. He said, I realized one thing happened at summer camp one time. they didn't tell me that I was supposed to be giving a large lecture to students. He had about 250 students he was supposed to present to at camp. And guess how many minutes he had to prepare that lecture? 15 minutes. Now, as it turns out, in parliamentary debate, that's exactly the amount of prep time you have before you present your case. So, and he had done very well as a parliamentary debater and made multiple national final rounds. So for him to have that experience and then to find a very practical manifestation of it, one summer evening up in, and I won't mention which camp it is so as to not embarrass that particular camp for not telling their counselor that he's going to be giving a speech. It's just one of those ways. I mean, I think about some of our teachers, who have gone on, and some of the skills that they've learned. But even mothers who stay at home, some of the kinds of things that they've done. There's so many different places where people in the forensics community have ended up. Some have done things such as written shows like CSI. Former Arizona State interpretation person ended up working and developing the plot for CSI and some of the other subsequent ones. Television and media, a variety of places, but also I think in more important kind of day-to-day places where that ability to speak has just really, in a sense, impacted other people.
Other questions? Comments, Leah?
It's good to hear you speak. I don't think I've heard you speak, Michael, like this since you were a candidate.
That was.
I've been in classes sometimes, but this is only the second time I've heard you speak formally, and I appreciated it very much.
Michael, just tell us one story or fantasy theme that you remember in the teams or among the forensic students that you think pull them together. Do you have one of those right coming to mind?
There are a variety. I'm not sure which one I should actually use at this point.
Sometimes they're not very good to share.
Well, what I was going to ask is sometimes, when we think about fantasy themes, that's true. Fantasy themes don't always happen because of good things that happen. Sometimes bad things that happen. I think about one example that's immediately popping to mind is the student who, in a sense, was late to almost every single tournament he attended. I think Abby probably knows who I'm referring to. But part of that, in a sense, is that, as a result, people had to kind of rally around and come alongside this person to help this person in order to do the kinds of things he needed to do, to get ready for the tournament. And I think a lot of times what often happens is it might be, and I think of several situations where, people have just gotten really sick and couldn't do the kinds of things that they wanted to do. In particular, one of the events that we do is called extemporaneous speaking. And in that, students have to prepare on a wide variety of current events. And pretty much what they're doing is they're researching everything that goes on in current events, whether it be economic, whether it be international relations, whether it be domestic politics. And several years ago, one of our students who was most responsible for putting together the files got really sick right before a national tournament. And so she couldn't put together the files the way in which she was normally accustomed to doing. So it took the rest of the team to kind of come alongside, and even some of our students who weren't doing that event said, all right, well, let me pitch in and help. I'll look up a couple of things and print off. And this was in the days when we still printed, and some of my colleagues remember that we had the tubs that were filled with these files that kind of strewn around my office. But, when people kind of pitched in and said, I can do this event, but I know I need to help out. Those are the kinds of things that I think any coach, and certainly I don't know.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we all have a probably a more honorable sense of what it is that we do, regardless of what we do, and that to serve, we don't have to go on the mission field, but
That's
every
right.
day, in every activity. And we appreciate you reminding us that. Thank you.